Rumination. Something happens, it ends, and then it doesn't really end. You're in the shower 3 days later and you're back in that conversation, word for word, running through what you said, what they said, what you should have said instead. The actual moment is long gone, but your brain hasn't filed it away yet. It's still holding it up, turning it over, looking for something. Rumination doesn't replay things randomly. It replays the ones that felt unresolved. The argument where neither person really won. The moment you hesitated and said the wrong thing anyway. The version of you that didn't show up the way you wanted to. The strange part is, the more you go over it, the less clarity you get. You'd think repetition would eventually settle it. It rarely does. Mostly it just keeps the feeling alive. That low hum of something unfinished sitting just underneath everything else you're doing. You notice it most when you're doing something else. Driving, trying to sleep, midway through a task that requires almost no focus. That's when it surfaces. Not because you decided to think about it, but because your brain decided it wasn't done yet. Worry. If rumination lives in the past, worry lives somewhere that doesn't exist yet. It works quietly. You send an email and immediately start imagining how it might be received. You make a plan, and before you've even taken a step, you're already 3 scenarios deep into what could go wrong. It's not pessimism exactly. It's more like your brain running simulations on its own. The subject changes all the time. Money, relationships, health, work, whatever feels most uncertain right now is where it tends to settle. But the mechanism stays the same. A gap opens between where you are and where things are headed, and worry fills it with possibilities, mostly the uncomfortable ones. What's easy to miss is how automatic it is. It doesn't feel like a choice. You're not sitting down and deciding to stress about next week. It just starts. A thought appears, another connects to it, and before long you're deep in a version of the future that may never happen, but feels completely real while you're in it. The other thing about worry is that it often disguises itself as preparation. If you've already imagined the worst outcome, maybe you'll be more ready for it. There's a quiet logic there. But mentally living through something for hours and actually being ready for it, those aren't really the same thing. Catastrophizing. Worry imagines the future. Catastrophizing jumps straight to the worst version of it. It's fast. One thought connects to another, and instead of the chain stopping at a reasonable concern, it keeps going. A missed call becomes someone being upset with you. A mistake at work becomes a much larger consequence. A small pain becomes something serious. Each step feels logical in the moment. It's just that the steps only move in one direction. The thing is, catastrophizing doesn't always feel extreme while it's happening. It feels realistic. Like you're just acknowledging what could actually happen. The line between thinking clearly about a risk and spiraling can be surprisingly hard to see from the inside. There's usually a physical component too, a tightening somewhere, a restlessness. The body tends to respond to imagined threats almost the same way it responds to real ones. So by the time you've worked through 3 or 4 worst-case scenarios, your body is already reacting as if those things are happening, not preparing for them, responding to them. It tends to show up most around things that feel outside your control, which is a long list. Analysis paralysis. At some point, having more information stops helping. You've done the research, you've compared the options, you know the reasonable choice, and still, you go back to the tabs, reread the same reviews, make the same list again in a slightly different order. Not because new information has appeared, just because it doesn't feel settled yet. Analysis paralysis doesn't usually come from not knowing enough. It comes from not wanting to choose wrong. And the more a decision feels reversible, the easier it is to keep turning it over. Strangely, smaller decisions sometimes get more of this treatment than bigger ones. Not because they matter more, but because there's no obvious right answer, and the brain reads that as something still open. What it looks like in practice. A decision that should take 20 minutes takes 2 weeks. You ask other people's opinions not because you're going to follow them, but because you're hoping one of them will just make the discomfort stop. You feel clear on what you want, and then read one more thing and feel less clear than before. There's a version of overthinking that looks productive from the outside. Thorough, careful, and sometimes it is. But sometimes you're just moving in circles while calling it due diligence. Mind reading. Nobody tells you what they're actually thinking, so you fill in the gaps. Someone gives you a short reply and you spend an hour wondering if something shifted between you. A person glances away mid-conversation and you file it somewhere. A compliment lands with a slightly flat tone and you start second-guessing what they actually meant. None of this is deliberate. It just happens because people are ambiguous and uncertainty is uncomfortable and your brain would rather have an answer, even a wrong one, then no answer at all. Mind reading tends to pull toward the negative. When you don't know what someone's thinking, you're more likely to assume they're quietly disappointed or bothered or less interested than before. Neutral responses get read as distant. Silence gets read as something specific. The brain fills in blanks with whatever feels most emotionally charged, and that's rarely the most generous interpretation. What's quietly interesting is how often people are doing this to each other at the same time. One person is worrying about what the other thinks. The other person is doing the same thing, both carrying an entire conversation that never happened, responding to a version of each other that exists mostly in their own heads. Overgeneralizing. One thing goes wrong and somehow the whole picture shifts. That's the quiet part of this. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. You get one piece of bad news or one conversation ends awkwardly, and within minutes, your brain has made it mean something much larger. About your job, about how people see you, about some pattern you're now convinced has always been there. The strange part is how clean it feels in the moment. Like the conclusion makes sense. Like you were just finally seeing clearly. But what actually happened is your brain took one data point and drew a line through everything. One difficult week becomes, this is always how it goes. One person's coldness becomes, people don't really like me. The sample size is tiny. The conclusion is enormous. It's not always loud. Sometimes it just quietly shifts what you expect. You stop assuming something will go well, not because of evidence, just because of one time it didn't. Perfectionistic thinking. There's a version of this that doesn't get talked about much. It's not about being a perfectionist in the traditional sense, needing everything spotless or color-coded. It's subtler. It's the email you've rewritten 4 times and still haven't sent. The plan you won't start because the conditions aren't quite right yet. The decision that keeps getting delayed because you haven't fully figured out how it ends. The brain in this mode is always searching for a version of something that has no gaps, no loose ends, nothing that could come back around later. And because that version basically doesn't exist, there's always a gap somewhere. The loop keeps running. You keep looking, keep adjusting, keep almost being ready. What makes it hard to spot is that it looks like effort, like care. It doesn't feel like stalling, it feels like being thorough. But the consistent thread is that the bar moves. You get closer and the standard shifts just slightly. Just enough to keep you working towards something that never quite arrives. Second guessing. This one shows up after. Once something is decided, once the moment has passed, that's often when the questioning starts. You said yes to something and now you're not sure if you should have. You took the path that made sense at the time, and now you're running the other path in your head, filling in details that aren't real, giving it outcomes that may never have happened. The odd thing about second guessing is that it's mostly backward facing. The decision is already made. There's nothing to actually change, but the brain keeps returning to it anyway, like it's still open. Like if you think about it long enough, you'll find the right answer to a question that's already been answered. It often peaks at night or in quiet moments, when there's not enough else happening to pull focus. The more time you had to think before deciding, the more material there is to work through after. And the more confident you were in the moment, sometimes the more surprising it is when the doubt shows up anyway. Mental load loop. This one is less about one specific thought and more about the background noise of everything that needs to happen. Not urgent things, just things. The list that never fully empties. Somewhere in the background, the brain is tracking what hasn't been done, what's coming, what you said you'd handle, what you almost forgot. It doesn't always feel like stress. Sometimes it just feels like a kind of ambient busyness in the mind. You're doing one thing, but there's a quiet awareness of the other 12. You finish something, and almost immediately something else surfaces. Not pushed by urgency, just present. What makes this loop different is that it persists even in downtime. You sit down to rest and the list appears. Not to panic, just to remind. Just to make sure you haven't forgotten. The brain treats the mental inventory like something that always needs to be kept current, even when there's nothing actionable to do with it right now. Meaning-making loop. This might be the quietest one. Someone says something and you spend the next hour figuring out what they meant. A situation plays out in an unexpected way and you turn it over, looking for the logic. Not because it matters enormously, sometimes it's something small, but because your brain wants the explanation. It wants the thing to make sense. It's almost automatic. The moment something doesn't add up or feels ambiguous or lands differently than expected, the analysis starts. You replay what was said. You consider the tone. You think about context you might have missed or meaning that was never stated out loud. You build a theory. Then you question the theory. What often gets missed is that this loop runs on things that were never meant to carry that much weight. The other person may not have thought about it at all, but your brain flagged it as incomplete, and incomplete things tend to stay open until there's some kind of resolution, even if that resolution is just deciding how to interpret it.